Y'all ever heard the phrase, go big or go home? Y'all ever heard that one? What does it mean? Basically,
Go all out.
yeah, you give your all for what you're doing, and then if you're not, you're just kind of wasting your time. If you want to do something big, you've got to have a big plan for it, and that's so much of how we operate. This world likes to think or dream big, and it often has huge expectations. Right? We are disappointed oftentimes because things don't meet those expectations, but we like to think of ourselves. We criticize those that are younger from us a lot of times, and of course it really started with us. But we criticize and like to think that we are the microwave generation. Y'all heard of that? Or in the sense of that you're people who can't wait for anything, so you have to have everything now. But we're not the only ones who are like that. We're not the only ones who hate waiting for something. So in the days of Yeshua, the concept of the kingdom, would you say it was big or was it small? The concept of what they were expecting.
Small compared to his vision.
Well, in a sense, but they were expecting the big thing. They were expecting the great, grand, and glorious thing. The kingdom was powerful, and when the kingdom arrived, it was, for them, it was a go big or go home kind of moment. That's what they wanted. And so when Messiah steps on the scene, in their mind, they were expecting him to step up and step in and take over. Right? To take on and defeat the world superpower and set up his throne. They expected that something big, something that was fully formed, something that was mature, the Messiah who is large and in charge. That's what they were expecting. That's what they were looking for the most part. But that's not what they got. In that moment anyway. The kingdom, the plan of God, the mind of God doesn't always work the way we think he should, on the timetable that we think he should, and doing it the way that we think he should. He often does it the opposite of what we expect, because he often starts small and watches it grow into something big. James talks about it in the sense of great fires are started from what? A very small spark. Or a great ship is steered from a very small rudder. Or as Yeshua himself taught when he talked about the kingdom in Matthew 13, he says, he presents them another parable, saying that the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, yet when it's fully grown, it is greater than all the other herbs. It becomes like a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. That's what he says the kingdom is like. It's not like what they were expecting. It's not going to happen the way they think. Sometimes when Yeshua talks about the seed, and when he talks about the parables, sometimes he talks about the seed being the word of God that the sower sows. But in this parable, he identifies the seed as the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. When you think about it, who is the man who's taking this seed and planting it? You can say that's God. You can say that's the Messiah. Either one of those would be fine. What is the field that he's planting it in? He's planting it in this world that we live in, right? So God, essentially, he is sowing the seed of his kingdom in the field of this world. But it's not a big, spectacular moment when he does that. It's actually a pretty small one. A moment that most of the world is never going to notice and could easily lose track of. Who would notice? A mustard seed, if y'all have ever seen any of those, they are tiny. Who would notice somebody coming along and notice them dropping a mustard seed somewhere in the world? Would that be easy to miss? Yeah. It would be easy to lose track of. So this unnoticed moment, this seed would be free, because it was unnoticed, it would be free to grow before anyone knew it, it would be big enough that the world then would have to respond and react to it. And the small things sometimes have big effect sometimes have big consequences. Sometimes one man or one woman's decision, one man or one woman's actions, like obedience, can have a great effect on the growth of this seed. We see about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. See, what then is Apollos? This is some of the debate, you say, about who were people following, who were people looking toward. He says, who then is Apollos, and what is Paul? Servants, through whom you came to trust, and to each as the Lord gave. He says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. He gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. God is the one who's in charge of all of that. He is in charge of the growth of the kingdom. He doesn't come and ask us what we think should happen, or what our opinion should be, or when we think it should happen. So essentially, He is the one who is the gardener. He is the one who wants to see a crop, wants to see something produce fruit. He, before they even plant anything, the typical gardener will do some things to make it ready. He'll prepare the soil. He has to have a plan of what he's going to plant. He has to plan the kind of fruit that he wants to harvest. What do you think when you think about God? He's planting the kingdom of heaven. He's planting the kingdom of God here in the earth. What do you think that God wants to harvest amongst us? In a lot of ways, He wants to harvest our redemption. He wants to harvest us as a people that are redeemed. And then to accomplish that, He plants the Messiah. He plants a small mustard seed that would eventually move mountains. And He planted this seed all the way back. We see it first in Genesis 3:15. In speaking to the serpent in this time of consequence. And He says, I will put animosity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and he will crush your head, and you will crush his heel. Now, who's that seed that He's talking about here? He's talking about Messiah. He's talking about Yeshua. That seed was declared. That seed was spoken and planted while everybody was still in the garden. They hadn't left yet. And Messiah and His kingdom has been growing ever since. And that seed, was passed on through that lineage of the people that followed after Adam and Eve, through Seth, those who worshiped God while they were in a world. They were surrounded by a people that were descending further and further into darkness, into greater and greater violence, into the rejection and cursing of God. That's the world that this seed was planted into. And it was still small. It was small for a good time. It was only a few of those seeds were left by the time of Noah's day. How many of those seeds were even around to continue on? 8 people survived through all of this population. All the rest had been picked off like seeds that are cast on the road. And what does Yeshua say in the parable of the sower and the soils? The seed that's cast on the road, the birds come along and pick it off. Satan comes along and picks them off. But the seed that landed in the good soil, that is still going to produce a fruitful harvest. And it may not be in the time that they can see it. It'll produce a harvest in the future. Because it all starts, let's see, do I have this up here? In a small land. God, we know that He owns it all, that everything is His. But most people, when we think about our own property, if you have any type of house, if you have any type of land with your place, we use our property in different ways, different parts for different purposes, right? But what do you typically tend to grow closest to your home or closest to your house? Do you put the great fields of wheat and things right next to your house? No, that's usually a little bit farther away. Usually what you grow right by your house will either be your flowers or your vegetable garden. Those things that you find that you have the most frequent need to get in your hands dirty with. You know, the things that you have to clean up the most, or that things that have the most beauty, your treasured things. You have to spend more time weeding them. You have to spend more time protecting them. That's what the promised land is like to the Father. You know, it's like His garden that where he plants what is essential for Him and His purposes, because He takes up residence where? In Jerusalem. That's where He makes His name to dwell. And usually by comparison, when you think of your garden or your flowers or things like that, you know, by comparison on your property, how much do you think your flowers or your garden takes up as like a percentage of your whole property that you own? Usually, by comparison, it's pretty small. It's not usually a very large amount. And when you think about this, neither is Israel. Neither is the promised land. You know, the land that God took Abraham to, where He calls him out of Ur of the Chaldees, is important. But it's not because it's large. It's not because it's big in size. I found some things about it. Israel, when you think about all the nations in terms of size and area, Israel ranks 153rd of all the nations in the world. That's right. That's slightly larger than Slovenia. It's smaller than El Salvador, Belize, the Republic of North Macedonia. Y'all even heard of some of those? Taiwan, by comparison, the island nation of Taiwan is number 137. So we think of Taiwan as being really small, but it is bigger than Israel is by the amount of land that it controls. Israel qualifies as 0.0% of the world's landmass. It doesn't have enough to get a percentage point. It is 8,019 square miles of its total area. Of course, this is a few years, because this number fluctuates as they give up land or they gain some. By comparison, the United States is number 4 on the list. We are right behind Russia, Canada, and China. And our total area, as opposed to 8,000, our total land area is 3,618,718 square miles, for 6.1% of the total land mass on the planet. That's the United States. So we are number 4. But Abraham, he was brought what is to essentially the crossroads of the world, where travelers and tradesmen and conquerors from Europe, Africa, and Asia, they would all come through this territory. They all wanted to control it. And actually, if we can get the light turned off for a second, I want you all to see this. I found a neat little video. It doesn't have any audio, but it shows some of this territory. That's the kingdom of Egypt. And just how these different groups have arisen over the time periods to try to control it. So that's about the maximum range that the kingdom of Israel ever got. But how does it compare to these kingdoms and these nations that are building up around them? By comparison, it's not a whole lot. That's the Persian Empire, that's Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire. You can get Rome. By comparison, Israel would not be a world superpower. It doesn't have the size or the influence. That's the Islamic invasion at about the 600s, 650 AD. The Turkish Empire.
Yeah, first Turkish Empire.
And that's the Crusades. That's the retaking by Saladin the Great, as he's called. That's the Mongols. They never quite made it down into Israel. Ottoman, you're getting up close to World War I. events that happened after that. And in the midst of all of this, in 1948, you have just a little sliver of land, and it begins to expand, and you're starting to see territory about what we have today. By comparison, how big is that? It's pretty tiny. And yet, how much of the world's attention is still focused right there? How much of everything that's going on still is focused on that one small little sliver of land? All right, we can turn the light back on. See, God wanted Abraham and his seed to have this land. And it started rather small with just a cave and a field. That's all it started with. Even though God wanted him to have it, it didn't start with this great big moment. It started with something small brought on by the death of his wife, Sarah. So Sarah's life was 127 years, the years of Sarah's life. She died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from before his dead one and spoke to the sons of Heth, that's some of the Canaanites.
Hittites.
Hittites, well,
Hittites.
they're related because he descended from Canaan. It says that back in chapter 10 of Genesis.
They're a different people group. Yeah.
I am an outsider and a sojourner among you. Give me a gravesite among you, so that I may bury my dead from before my presence. That's what he starts with. He's wanting to bury his wife. And so because of that, he begins to enter in negotiations with those that live there and already own or already control the property. And after a time of negotiation where the price is probably elevated a little bit beyond what it needed to be, it says, now Ephron's field that is in Machpelah next to Mamre, the field and the cave that is in it, and all the trees that are in the field of all its surroundings territory, was handed over to Abraham as a purchased possession in the eyes of the sons of Heth, before all those who enter the gate of his city. It says, afterward, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah next to Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And so the field and all the cave that was in it were handed over to Abraham as a gravesite from the sons of Heth. So this small field, its trees and its cave, was this foothold for Abraham and his descendants. It was gave him a legal claim in the land, and that was the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promise to him from back in Genesis chapter 12, all the way back there. When he was called out, he says, Abraham passed through the land as far as the place of Shechem, as far as Moreh's big tree. The Canaanites were in the land then. Then Adonai appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your seed. So there he built an altar to Adonai who had appeared to him. This is where it started. It wasn't some great big conquering thing. It wasn't some great big purchase. It wasn't like what you see with the invasion of Normandy in World War II, where they were just, all they wanted to do was try to establish a beachhead of some kind of foothold, because they knew if they could get just that little bitty piece, then they'd be able to expand out throughout the rest of Europe and maybe turn the course of the war. So what started as a small plot of land grew into this kingdom that went from Syria and such in the north to Egypt, some of these territories down here in the south. And some of it, some of the promises were talking up to the Euphrates River, even over here into this direction and such, the Mediterranean Sea, and some of these things. Eventually, all of that. And then you see this small little spot, it's not even this place that he got with Hebron was just that first opening possession. that down payment, so to speak, of the promise that was going to be fulfilled later. And when you read some of the things that later, when you read some about the future borders of the Messianic reign and the New Jerusalem and such like that, that's described in Revelation 21, they talk about it as having these walls that are 12,000 stadia long. And the numbers that they gave in there, that one stadia was about 600 feet or so, is what some Bibles will say. So one wall, when you calculate that out, and you do a little bit of algebra that everybody hates doing, it's about 1,400 miles long, is how big that city is supposed to be, the New Jerusalem. And I'm hoping this is to scale, because I found some people that tried to map that out of what it would look like. But that's supposed to be just the New Jerusalem. Now, by comparison, it's supposed to be something like that. I'm thinking that's a little large, but I don't know. But by comparison, that's a pretty good sized city, isn't it? And that would hold a good sized population in there. But when he talks about it, the small land, it didn't take much for this kingdom, for this promise to start being fulfilled. It went unnoticed. There was no threat, really, by Abraham getting this small little piece of land. And yet, look what comes from it. Look what it grows into. It grows into something great. It grows into something amazing. But you consider also how it started. Another way of putting how it started was this vision when Nebuchadnezzar was seeing this vision of a statue where he saw the head of gold. It says, the head of that statue was of pure gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze. He's going through this sequence of kingdoms that were coming. He says, its legs of iron and its feet partly iron and partly clay. And while you were watching, a stone, the word Eben, was cut out, but not by hands. And it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from summer threshing floors, that the wind blows away, and not a trace of them could be found. All of these great kingdoms that he's talking about were gone. Then the stone, and that stone, is not something very large. The stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. He goes on in verse 44, he says, now in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will this kingdom be left to another people. It will crush and bring into an end all of these kingdoms, but it will endure forever. That statue was made up of those superpower kingdoms that we looked at that video about a little bit earlier. And the last one is a mix of clay and iron, partly strong but also partly brittle, because this people had so mixed together. They had nothing that unified them, that kept them together. And in the midst of these great kingdoms, this small movable stone, this Eben, where we get out of the song, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, here I raise my Ebenezer, my stone of help. So that stone was cut out, started by God, and it probably went completely unnoticed by the world powers. But it's going to grow and it's going to destroy all rivals, and this kingdom will never end. What starts small in God's hands changes the world, changes everything. That small foothold in the land changed the destiny of the world. It also changes the destiny of that small family. They were living, I should say, we are living with the growth of the kingdom that started small with a small plot of land, but also with a single man and his family. Back with Abraham. Abraham was just a man in Ur. He wasn't even the head of his clan. He wasn't the most important or the most revered, and yet God started with him, with this small family. and he tended to that seed. He took Abraham, then it was essentially, he was essentially a Gentile, essentially a wild shoot out there in the world, and cultivated him into a family that produced the kind of harvest that the Father was looking for. Again, it started with one man. His wife didn't even have kids yet at this time. And from this small family, the Father declares that Abraham's seed will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Can you imagine standing out there looking up and saying, that's how many descendants are going to come from you? I looked up a couple other things. An astronomer named Dorrit Hofflet of Yale University, she tabulated all the stars that should be visible from the Earth that are measurable to the naked eye, essentially, that most people can't live or can't see a star that's less than or magnitude 6.5. And so she calculates up that all of the stars that are 6.5 or greater are only 9,096 stars across the entire world, and that's both hemispheres. You can really only see about 9,000. So this picture is a little doctored. So that means if both hemispheres can see about 9,000 or 10,000, if you want to give it that, maybe you can see 10,000. If that's in both hemispheres, what do you have to do? You really have to cut that in half. Because if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're only going to see the stars on the northern side. You look at some of the best star charts that the Chinese have. They only numbered about 1,500 of their stars. And that's really not that many when you think about it. And yet somehow, what's amazing in this, if all you can see at a max is 5,000 stars, who do you think would have told him that the number of stars would actually rival the number of sand on the seashore? Who could have told him that? Would Moses have known that? No. He would have looked up there and he would say, okay, I can count those to a degree. There's only a few thousand of them. But somehow or another, that number is actually more or greater than the sands on the shore. Only God would know just how many there are. Only God could say that He sees a far bigger universe than we do. Even with our telescopes, He sees more. But this family, it's all starting with this small family. And it doesn't start big. It doesn't start fully formed. It doesn't start powerful or numerous. In fact, he says specifically He didn't choose them for any of that. He says, you are a holy people to Adonai your God. From all the peoples of the face of the earth, Adonai your God has chosen you to be His treasured people. What do you do with your treasured things, with the things that you want to grow that are special? You keep them close. So it's not because you are more numerous than all the peoples that Adonai set His love on you and chose you, for you are the least of all the peoples. It was because they were small that they were chosen. It was because they were foolish in the eyes of the world that they were chosen. God chooses, as 1 Corinthians talks about, He chooses the foolish things of this world to do what? To shame the wise. The weak things of this world to confuse or shame the strong. All of it is to shame those who think that they've got it all figured out, but it's really to exalt God and His plan and His purpose and His sovereignty. See, when something is small or young, it has to be treated carefully and tenderly. It has to be protected. When you think about when you've got a garden and you're just starting to get some sprouts coming up out of the ground, you have to be careful with that. It has to be protected from the weeds, from the tares, and those things that will grow up much faster and choke it out. Choke out the seed that was planted and make it unfruitful. This seed had to be protected. It couldn't be sown or mixed with these other seeds. The future legacy had to be preserved, and what started small is also going to be swallowed up by the already existing weeds, because it'll lose its distinctiveness, it'll lose its identity, to be choked out and blend in with everything else if steps were not taken to keep the seed's cultivated status. It would be overrun. It wouldn't take much for this still small family to go back to what it was before the call of God. You know, Abraham had to protect the distinctiveness of his family, of the seed that was coming after him, that legacy of faith. And so Abraham, in this Torah portion, he takes steps to protect that future by saying to his servant in Genesis 24, he says, you will not take a wife for my son from among the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am dwelling. On the contrary, to my land and to my relatives you must go and get a wife for my son Isaac. But the servant said to him, suppose the woman were unwilling to follow after me to this land. Should I then have your son go back to the land that you came from? And Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not return my son there. See to it. Make sure. Protect this moment. See, the Canaanites were the dominant seed in the land at the time. They would quickly overwhelm Abraham and his seed if he wasn't careful. So he does, what a lot of farmers will do. Have y'all ever heard the concept of an heirloom seeds? Right? Y'all know what those are? An heirloom seed comes from plants that pass on their characteristics and their traits from the parent plant to the child. It's a seed from a plant that has been passed from one generation to another, carefully grown and saved, because that's something considered valuable. The value could be its flavor, its productivity, its hardiness, its adaptability. Abraham is treating his seed, his son, Isaac, like one of these heirloom seeds, because he knows that he doesn't want to create a hybrid offspring, a mix of his faith in Adonai with the paganism that the Canaanites so lived in, because the distinctiveness of his family would be lost. And neither does he want to send his son Isaac back to where he came from, because that poses risks as well. What if his son Isaac is convinced to stay up there, and he thinks it might be better for him up there outside of this land of promise? Then the seed would have left the garden that God had prepared. So even while the servant, and this is something that we know that's a possibility, he doesn't want him to go back, because even while the servant is there, Rebekah's family tries to figure out a way to delay him and his caravan from ever going home. He says, tries to keep him there 10 more days. He says, when they arose in the morning after they had met and talked and arranged a marriage, he says, send me off to my master. But her brother, that's Laban, with her mother said, young woman, stay with us a few days or 10, and afterwards she may go. But he said to them, don't delay me, since Adonai has made my way successful. Send me off so that I can go to my master. So they said, we'll call the young woman and let's ask her opinion. Right? Now what do you think they were hoping she would say? Oh, let me stay. I want to say goodbye to all my friends, my mother. I can't just pack up and leave in one moment. I got to stay for a while. That's probably what they were hoping she would say. And after those 10 days, after those times of saying goodbye, what do you think they would say then? Oh, just stay a little longer. Don't go yet. I mean, it's almost a festival day or something else comes along. You haven't seen cousin Jeffy back in Ur. He's on his way up here. I sent him a message that you had to come and see him, and thinking of Isaac and such like that. He's going to just send a message. He'll be here in a week. Just stay a little longer. If Isaac had gone up there, they'd be pulling that kind of stuff all the time, because that's exactly what Laban did with Jacob. Jacob agreed to work for 7 years in order to marry Rachel. But Laban figured out through all of his scheming and work, he figured out how to keep Jacob there for 20 years. That's quite an extension. But imagine the kind of bad influence Laban could have had on Isaac, if he went up there and stayed. Imagine how much mixing could have gone on with Laban's faith and Isaac's had he been coerced to stay. Imagine, if Isaac was up there and he had his children up there, Laban would be having greater influence over him. He wouldn't have been able to experience Abraham's influence, who was still alive during during Jacob and Esau's childhood. So this seed had to be protected. This legacy of faith, this godly offspring would have been at great risk had Isaac obtained a wife from among the Canaanites, or had he left the land to go back. And that's important for us to remember. In our day, for those of us who are essentially a first generation of taking up this way of life, these perspectives, these messianic perspectives, we too have to be diligent. Because what started as a conviction of the parents that's not where we are now isn't the only thing our children remember, is it? I remember, sharing my testimony a few years ago. I asked the crowd of about 150 some odd people, how many people grew up in this? And only the people under like 18 raised their hand, but most of them, they didn't grow up entirely. They still remember doing something else for a while and then crossing over or changing. But all of the adults were the ones that raised their hand. How many of you came to this later in life? And they all would do that. So that first generation is really in many ways the most vulnerable or most tempted to go back to the old ways or what they remember. They could be tempted, or they will be tempted, to go back as they become adults. So what they are a part of, what they belong to, or how they participate in things matters. Things like this, who they marry, does it matter? Will it make a difference about whether they continue on in these perspectives and beliefs? How and by what convictions they'll raise their kids will matter. All that we have tried to build, or all of these convictions that we have had as the parents raising kids, could be undone in one generation. What starts small could stay small, could disappear. But thanks to the faithfulness of this servant, and thanks to God who sent the angel ahead of him to make his purpose successful, the servant was able to find a godly wife for Isaac, a wife who was first noticed not because of her beauty, but because of her generosity, her hospitality, and her work ethic. All of those things were mentioned and stated and demonstrated before it ever called her beautiful. This future seed was protected. The nation grew from this small family with this small plot of land, this 70 people when it was going down into Egypt. They came out with millions. And God has always protected them. Even when it was in times of judgment, He has always preserved a remnant of the seed so that it's not completely lost, so that His promises would still be fulfilled. And He made many promises to Abraham and his seed. And there were all these great promises, all this fulfillment started just like the mustard seed. They started small and almost unnoticed, and these small fulfillments that were happening over and over again grew larger and larger. And so He who began this good work, the planting of the kingdom in the world, He cultivated it and protected it to carry it on to its completion. But not even Abraham got to see all of those fulfillments. He didn't even get to see all of these moments. Certainly he didn't see all of their outcomes. He only believed the promises that were made. He only believed and had faith in the God who stated it. This is what it talks about in Hebrews 11. Faith is the reality of what is hoped for the proof of what is not seen. For by it our ancestors won God's approval. And it goes on to describe how Abraham acted and behaved in response to that. 1 Peter talks about it as well. He says, though you have not seen him, you love him. He's talking to the believers in the day. His own readers were not there when Yeshua was walking around. He says, though not seeing him now, you believe in him, and you rejoice with inexpressible and glorious joy, because you are receiving the goal of your faith, the salvation of your souls. The goal of our faith, our redemption, started not as something great, not as something huge or big, but it started as something small. Started just as a seed that was mentioned all the way back at the beginning. It started small and began to grow. It was protected. It was cultivated over the centuries. You know, the small family became a great people. This small plot of land became a kingdom. And that small seed was born as a small baby and grew. And as Luke talks about it, it says he kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with men. What started small became someone great. Became our great Messiah, our Redeemer, and our King. See, not all things that are important in this world start off as something that everybody notices. And sometimes the small decisions, the small things that we do in life, the small things have a big impact. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the future. We don't know where all that goes. The decisions that we make matter. The decisions that they were making matter. And so we need to see what God is going to do even when we even when we are faithful in the little things. What can He do with it? Because it's in Him that our hope is found. It's in Him that this kingdom is growing and coming. And it's going to be something wonderful. This kingdom, it's in Him that we are gathered from the nations and we're brought home. That harvest that is to come. So sometimes it may seem small or it may not seem important, but God can do great things with small things.